After some significant debate, our founding fathers thought it wise to amend the Constitution they were drafting back in 1789 with a collection of guarantees meant to safeguard our political freedoms. They called it the Bill of Rights and hoped it would secure our freedom of religion, of speech, of assembly, amongst important others. What it left out, however, was any provision meant to secure our economic freedom. Joining me today via Skype from his home in San Jose, California to discuss this idea is Scott Myers-Lipton. Dr. Myers-Lipton is a professor of sociology at San Jose State University and the author of Ending Extreme Inequality, an economic Bill of Rights to eliminate poverty. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you, Peter, for having me on today.
A pleasure. Let's first try to understand what it is exactly that we're talking about.
Yeah.
You're not talking about an end to inequality, but rather extreme inequality. When you say extreme, what exactly are you aiming to eliminate?
Well, I think importantly, when you look at inequality, Americans have always accepted some level of inequality. It's the price of living in a capitalist society. You know, we could talk about, and hopefully we will, the benefits of capitalism. You know, Franklin Roosevelt and others talked about releasing the creativity of humanity. You know, technological innovation, and all these things are a positive of the capitalist system. However, it has another side to it that can, under certain conditions, lead to not just inequality, but where the top 1% and the top 0.01% start controlling so much of the wealth and of the income. And those have happened throughout our history. They happened during the 1890s, they happened during the Roaring 20s, and they're happening today. And there needs to be a correction. There historically has been, if you look historically, corrections to that. And so what I'm calling for, and what others have called for, is this idea of an economic Bill of Rights, that just as you were saying, we've guaranteed our political rights, but not our economic rights. So we've been playing with what could be solutions, but I really believe this is a potential solution, a long-term solution to the crisis of what I would call extreme or gross inequality, which we have today.
And certainly FDR laid out this vision of this second Bill of Rights. He introduced the idea of it in 1944 in his State of the Union address, very much tempered by the experience of the country coming through a Great Depression, through his experience as president trying to steer the country through that. What rights was he asking the government to try and ensure for American citizens?
There are 6 key rights that he was putting forth. One was, and I would say the most important, they're all important, right? Every right is important, but there's probably, for me, you know, the first 2 that he laid out are absolutely necessary. Because if you don't get those, then kind of nothing else we do will solve the problem. And that's the right to a job and the right to a living wage. And he put these out, and he put them out, and people at the time criticized him, saying he's anti-capitalist. He says, I'm not anti-capitalism. I'm trying to save capitalism. And he said this, as did Dr. Martin Luther King after him. And really, the last 3 years of King's life before he's assassinated is dedicated to this economic Bill of Rights. And they both said this: look, at capitalism, while it has its positives, it can create high levels of inequality, and it does not provide enough living wage jobs. So if the private sector doesn't produce that, both of them, you know, agreeing that the private sector has a huge role to play, then the public sector should be able to create those living wage jobs. And so we see Roosevelt, and we all know, you know, we've heard of people of our generation know about this, but I'm not sure if they know what it did for the country. And one of the things it did, it was the single greatest drop in unemployment in the history of the country, from 24% to 10% over a 6-year period. It put 4 million people to work doing what? Building schools, 9,000 schools. You know, it built hospitals. It rebuilt our roads. It really built the infrastructure, the bridges, 125,000 bridges the New Deal built. How many bridges do we have today that are structurally deficient? 125,000. We could turn this idea of public works. And here's the greatest thing of all, is that we don't have to pass any new legislation. In my research, one of the great things about doing research is you find out all sorts of new things. Humphrey Hawkins was passed, it's a bill, passed in 1978, saying exactly what I'm saying, as King said, as Roosevelt said. Look, capitalism doesn't produce enough living wage jobs. Therefore, we need to have public works as a response. anytime public works rise, or anytime unemployment rises above 3%, massive public works should be should be put forward by the federal government. Well, the government has just turned a blind eye to that, but that is still the law of the land. We have a public works bill. It's called Humphrey Hawkins, and my hope is that in the future we'll have 10,000 people in front of Ronald Wilson Reagan Airport, because Reagan was a supporter of public works. In front of the airport, the founder of modern conservatism, saying we need public works and we need this implemented, rather than, we don't have to enact anything, just implement what we already have, public works.
And certainly that's a key key element of the right to a job and to a living wage. Let's unpack each of those maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
So the First Amendment to this economic Bill of Rights is the right to a job. Certainly there are those who would criticize President Obama for his bailout of the financial sector during the Great Recession, while not also undertaking public works programs, as you're suggesting, as FDR did during the New Deal.
Absolutely.
Is it a legitimate criticism, and has the president done anything since then to make us think differently about how government can handle this right to a job that Americans should have?
Well, importantly, of the $787 billion that were part of that stimulus package, close to $300 billion were tax cuts. And we could argue tax cuts, good or bad, but that's usually not on the side of the progressives. Progressives are, it's usually the conservatives arguing that. So he took an idea that is, from the conservative side, which is fine. And my book talks about a bunch of conservative ideas. But what did he take on the progressive side? Well, he took on the progressive side $100 billion stimulus for public infrastructure. Well, there are two problems with that. One was it was considered by the people in the public infrastructure world a drop in the bucket. Our infrastructure need is over several $trillion. He offered $100 billion. So it was very little money. The second part of it was that how it was given out did not get down to the grassroots folks doing public infrastructure. It was given through kind of a top-down structure. So both in design and in the amount of quality or quantity of money, it was designed not in a great way. But I'm going to give you one idea from the Obama administration that did work in that time. Doesn't get very much attention. $1 billion, which in the world of the federal government is not very much money. It's a lot of money for you and me, but in the world of government, $1 billion is not much. They gave $1 billion to a welfare reform program, which said this: let's hire workers. Because that's what I'm saying. Let's hire workers. If the private industry, great, let's have the private industry create as many jobs and good jobs as possible. But if there is a need, and the need of our current, even though our unemployment is 4%, or for 5% nationally, it's here 4%. But if you look at the underemployment rate, you get 3 times about that, and that's the rate of people not working full-time jobs. And if you look at what kind of jobs they're getting, 58% of all jobs since the Great Recession at poverty level. So the jobs that we've created are at the poverty side, not at the living wage side. So we have to create some way to get more living wage jobs. Well, what did Obama do in this stimulus package? Gave $1 billion and hired local people and gave it to local agencies. So the money came down to the state and then to the counties, and they hired people. 260,000 people were hired with $1 billion. And so here's an example. And if we tie that to a living wage, we could actually create jobs. And they could not do makeshift work. They could do the work that is so necessary in our public infrastructure, which the American Civil Engineering Society, not a hotbed of radical thought, says that we have a crisis in our American infrastructure. And you don't have to go far. I'm sure back in Boston, you're having public infrastructure crisis. We just had in San Mateo, not too far from here, a pipeline blew up, had lots of folks, killed in that. We have public infrastructure crisis. We have a bridge that's about 5 miles from here. They say it's about to fall, and thousands of people are driving on that bridge all the time. So we can use our in this negative infrastructure crisis to actually create the jobs that are necessary. but I think also importantly at a living wage, and that's the key thing. We need to create jobs at a living wage.
In terms of the right to a job, and
Yep.
certainly you speak to the idea that public works programs are a central feature in
Mm-hmm.
helping government ensure that there are jobs available to
Yes.
Americans. What other means are there available to largely, I assume, government, yeah, to ensure that all Americans have access to a job, a full-time
Yeah,
job?
yeah. I think public works is definitely the main thrust of the people that are interested in the right to a job. It's been through public works. And what's I think really important for your listeners is that's a 130-year-old tradition in our country. It goes back to the recessions and the depressions of the 1890s, where local governments decided to respond to the crisis of the unemployment of that time. And then instituted at a national level during the Roosevelt administration, and then again put forward. If you go back to King advocating for what in that the march before he was murdered in Memphis, when he was going to go to D.C., he was calling for massive public work. So there's this long line in history of public works being offered as a solution, but there are others. One of the ideas, and I talk about in the book, definitely not as mainstream, but you're looking at cooperatives as a response. There's a cooperative in Spain that hires over 100,000 people that provide living wage jobs that are worker. And you talk about is bringing democracy to the economy. Here, where they're worker owners, and there are examples of that, and I highlight in my book, like in Cleveland, Ohio, where they are creating 10 different cooperatives, the Evergreen Cooperative Movement, 10 different cooperatives, 50 people in each team, creating solar energy, doing farming in the industrial city, creating gardens, but then selling the produce to and they've got people to buy in, partners to buy in, the public hospital, the university there, buying the goods and providing working class folks where the average income is $18,000, that if they join this cooperative over 8-year time frame, they can not only make $12, $13, $14 an hour, but have $65,000 saved up, and that would be assets they could use for either education or to buy a house. And so this creative idea of cooperatives is talked about in the book. And if you saw that movie by Michael Moore, it's highlighted his on Capitalism, a Love Story. Looking for alternatives and really bringing this, I think public works to me is the most powerful, but this cooperative movement is another way to create living wage jobs.
So yeah, and exactly that. Let's make the move from
Yep.
Amendment 1, right to a job,
Yep.
to Amendment 2,
Yep.
the right to a living wage. And
Yes.
and certainly we speak, I think the vernacular is the minimum wage, which
Yep.
interestingly, Massachusetts was the first state to require
Right.
such a minimum back in 1912.
That's right.
Good
That's
for
right.
us. Good for us.
Yay.
But what's the distinction to be drawn between the minimum wage and a living wage?
A minimum wage was, again, you said 1912 started this idea, and then taken to the national level in the 1930s by Roosevelt, where minimum wage was going to be to the entire country. But it would be that there would be some level agreed upon by the citizenships where no person could be paid less than that. Because if you go down that road of paying less and less, you move toward enslavement, where you pay $0 and for that. So there would be some level that everyone, the collective body of the citizenry would say that's nothing should be paid less than that. That because less than that it would be difficult to at least survive at any means whatsoever. Now, a living wage is different than that. A living wage pays for the basics, and food, rent, mortgage, transportation, clothing. The basics of society are paid for. In fact, what's interesting, you go back to the initial documents of that living wage. When living wage was thought of in the late 19th century, people said also leisure. That people, part of being a human being, should have some leisure time as well, not just work. So that's an important part of that. So, and interesting enough, this idea of a minimum wage versus living wage came up when my students decided to lead an effort to pass an increase in the wage. When they first started, they wanted a living wage. Well, They looked at what the living wage at that time in 2010 in Silicon Valley was $16 an hour for a person. And the minimum wage at the time was $8 an hour for the folks, in California and in San Jose. Well, when they started looking at numbers, and this is the political part of it, because there's the economic question around this, there's the political question, and then there's the moral question, I'd like to say. But the political question, or the political answer, was the people of our community would not support a living wage. We did the poll. There was vast, it did not poll well. And so no matter what we thought it was a great idea, we could run that campaign and lose. However,
right. I mean, essentially that would have been a doubling of the minimum wage.
That's
at the time,
right. That's right. So we put forward the idea of a substantial increase, one of the largest increases at the time for the minimum wage, a 25% increase in the minimum wage. So you can't sneeze at that, but it wasn't the living wage that was $16. So we put forward $10, and importantly, tied to the CPI, tied to the Consumer Price Index. Because why that's important, if we would have done this back in 1968 at the federal level, we would be having this conversation, and we wouldn't have the gross economic inequality which exists, which just so your listeners know clearly, I'm sure they were aware of it, but where the median income is basically going down. It's now down to $53,000. It was at $58,000, so it's gone down from 2007 till now, $6,000-7,000. The bottom folks actually losing ground by 2 or 3%. But the top, the 1%, they've gone up 120%. But here's the important part. The 0.01 or the 0.1% have gone up 300% of their income, and the 0.01%, 600%. So that gross inequality that occurred over the last 30 years, partly, not all, but one of the reasons is minimum wages have been kept stagnant. Maybe we could talk about the others too. So we decided to lead a campaign, and the polling for that was 70% of the citizens of San Jose believed that 70% of the folks said we believe in a 10% minimum, or $10 minimum wage with a CPI, meaning now it's at 10.30. So we passed that. We had, it was a group of students and myself passed a minimum wage. We reached out, of course, to labor, faith, the nonprofit community, created a large coalition, outspent 15-1. The Chamber of Commerce, the Restaurant Association, always have been opposed to minimum wage, came against it with over $1 million, probably $1.5 million. We had less than 100,000, and we won that campaign 60 to 40%. So the people spoke clearly. Minimum wage was too low. So it's now $10, but we did that because we wanted to show that we could impact questions of economic justice. And the students did. I mean, they felt that, I can remember the day that the mayor said that the Measure D, it was called, the minimum wage, was the single greatest threat to the downtown businesses. And the mayor and the students were like, wow, we're the single greatest threat. They felt empowered by it. But here's what happened since then. And this is important for the national debate, because we're having a national debate about minimum wage. Since the passing of the 25% increase, minimum wage has gone down, or the unemployment, which the other side says was going to go up, went down from 7.6% to 4.1%. And in the minimum wage sector, they've gone up. Jobs have gone up. If you look at dishwashers, up 15%. If you look at the cafe baristas, up like 15%. So all those minimum wage jobs all are up. And downtown businesses, the restaurants, up 20%. Has not had any negative impact on the community. And
you predicted my next question to you, which was, is that fear of higher minimum wage or a living wage will lead to a reduction in jobs? Is that founded in research, or is that myth?
Well, I think I should say this. We had actually said this. The one thing that we said was going to happen was there were going to be small businesses, and here's the key thing. The average age of a minimum wage worker is like 33, first of all. So that they're not the teenage folks. They're 33-year-olds. And the teenagers, by the way, deserve, because usually we just did some research on this and found 52% of all teenagers are saving for college. And of those, 30% have started college savings accounts. So if you're a high school student, you're trying to get to college and trying to save for it if you're going to work a minimum wage job. So these 33-year-old minimum wage workers, what happened to them, their jobs increased, but we one thing we said was going to happen was that small businesses were going to raise prices by 2 or 3%. And that has happened. And that's the one thing, and we were upfront about it, but we said a 25% increase in the minimum wage $4,000 extra dollars. And a year, that's $160 million more into our community because there's 40,000 plus minimum wage workers. We said they're not going to spend it in Switzerland. They're going to spend it right here in our local community. So we've had this overall unemployment for 7.6 to 4.1%. And it shows that we can raise minimum wage. And here's the exciting thing that's going on right now in San Jose is that San Jose is now leading a regional effort led by the mayor. A new mayor is leading this effort to have a regional minimum wage now of $15 by 2018. And there's a study that's going on right now, but that's what's on the table, that 15 cities of Santa Clara County are looking at putting forward this idea of a regional minimum wage. It must be passed by each city. That's the thing. You can't, it's the part of, that's the way it works. But we're looking at this regional attempt. So I think that's, and you know, we've got people in Congress putting forward a $15 minimum wage way beyond President Obama's 1010 to say we're just not, there's just not enough. And we've got to bring up the bottom because the bottom has been left behind in this, in the quote unquote recovery. The bottom have been left behind. So we've got to figure out ways. And this is just one of the many things that we can do to bring up the bottom.
So this notion, this notion of the living wage is something that's gaining certainly more traction.
Getting closer, right?
Across the country.
We're getting closer. Minimum wage now, living wage now is $19.06 in Santa Clara County. So no longer, we're at 10 right now at the minimum. We'd get to 15, you know, not yet there, but much closer than where we are.
We jump, well, and I should say last year, 38 states were taking up the issue of minimum wage
That's right.
in their states. So it certainly is something that is front and center for state legislatures and individual cities.
And cities.
Yeah.
And I think, and I would just encourage, if you're not happy in your city, if you feel like it's not enough, is that there's at least in California, we have, and I know it's in cities throughout the country, can pass citywide minimum wages that more reflective of the local environment. And here's the other thing, it's a way to get, I think we have to offer in this work of, you know, economic justice, ways for people to get involved. Because I think most people, my students, the biggest thing I overcome with my students is that they feel like they can make a difference. Because they don't know and they don't believe that if they put time in, something positive will happen. And so one of the things I try to do is to demonstrate by bringing my students who have won campaigns, the minimum wage just being one of them, they've won maybe 7 or 8 other campaigns, back to talk to them, to show them they can make a difference if they put in the time and the energy in our democracy. So I think it's not only a question of economic justice, this is really a question about who rules our country. I was reading an article about, do the plutocrats, I was reading this article, we're going to talk about it tomorrow. You know, this Goldman Sachs person wrote an idea about the plutocracy, that we now have a plutocracy. The 1% control, and they control 60% of consumer spending. So don't worry about the masses anymore, investors. Focus on what the plutocracy is doing. For me, I believe in what Lincoln said, you know, of the people, by the people, for the people. So yeah, I think we have to offer our citizens and residents a way to feel like they can change America, even though we're in the middle of a presidential election. You know, that's sometimes very distant to people rather than their own lives right here.
Let's go forward to amendment number 3, which is the right to a decent home.
Yes.
The sort of the early American response toward those unable to afford housing on their own was the poorhouse.
Right.
And I think that came from England. How ingrained sort of in the American consciousness is that kind of reflex, like to separate and consider almost pariah-like those who can't afford their own living circumstances?
Boy, that's a whole nother show, Peter. And
it's true. It's true, but it's central.
Yeah,
it's central. I think central to the idea of why we continue talking about the same issues generation after generation. Because somewhere deep we believe in these myths and these narratives.
Yeah. And the poorhouse was such a essential place for American. You know, we have there's several around us still. They're called old. I forget the name, but they're like old folks' homes. But those are the ones that were 100 years ago. Those were the poorhouses. So they don't exist in the same form, but they're here. But they're vital to understanding America, because what they did was they separated between who is considered the deserving poor and who is considered the undeserving poor. here was the crazy part, why the poorhouse didn't work, is that they put those two groups in their mind. They tried to separate out those two groups, and between the deserving poor, which they said were women, kids, if you were elderly or sick, and then the undeserving poor, who they believe were, because of their morality and bad choices they were making, that was what caused them. So it was the poorhouse was created based in a false understanding of what causes poverty. But I think the idea of the poorhouse is still with us. We still break up people into the deserving and the undeserving poor, and we then create a policy rather than looking at this. And this is how I try to look at it. If you create today, right now, 30% of our jobs right now, it's actually 28%, but 30% roughly of all the jobs pay poverty wages. They pay poverty wages. So if you have 30% of paying poverty wages in our economy, you're going to have a lot of poverty. It's just the way it is. So if we have that, if we look at the structure of the system, rather than will some people move out of poverty? Here's the sad part about America today. Our social mobility has now decreased, where we are less socially mobile than France and England, the two places where there had been little social mobility. That, for God's sake, they have a king still and a queen, right? This aristocracy. We broke away from that, saying that we humans, are kind of the creators of our world. But the reality of it today is we have this a system where there's little social mobility. If you are born into poverty, your chances of getting out of poverty, 45% of all people who are born in poverty will die in poverty. And only 20% more will get into the next class, the working class. So if you're born into poverty, 66% chance you're either going to die in poverty or get to the working class. That is not a dynamic, socially mobile society that I think, of the founders envisioned about for our economy. So there's got to be some adjustments. I would say this: we need a new social contract. The Republicans put forth the contract for America. I think progressives have to put forward a new social contract, that this does no longer work for the vast majority of Americans. And what the new social contract is an economic bill of rights, which guarantees some of these fundamental rights. And here's the interesting thing. They don't have to all come from leftist ideas. Several of these ideas were from the right. If you look at the guaranteed income, for example, that is Milton Friedman, the founder of libertarian conservative, libertarian thought. And so, and his frustration was, the federal bureaucracy around poverty. Well, I think we could have a grouping of the left and the right coming together around this idea. Say, okay, let's talk about getting rid of the federal bureaucracy around poverty, but let's guarantee a wage for all people. And that's what Milton Friedman was driving for. By the way, it was what Martin Luther King was driving for, and what Switzerland is going to vote on this year: a guaranteed income for all people. Regardless of their income, they all are going to get an income. It's going to be set at the vote is at $2,400. Now that idea, something maybe that the right and the left could rally around, and by the way, end poverty and end the social suffering that's going on in our country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I mean, we're at this point in time, we have a deficit in this country of $426 billion.
Yep.
We have a national debt of $13 trillion. So I suppose certainly a lot of people would say, geez, how are we going to afford, as a people, as a government, how are we going to afford affordable housing? How are we going to provide guaranteed incomes? How does that work with a population our size, whereas Switzerland substantially smaller? How do we generate? How do we earmark the necessary funds to make those things happen?
So I would argue this, and this is getting to the right to an education and the right to healthcare, is that we already spend the most amount, both on those topics, in education and in healthcare. The question is, and by the way, we have some of the best healthcare and education in the world. If you look at the top 20 and 30 and 40% of healthcare and education, the best in the world. So don't say that we have a broken education system. We actually know how to educate people quite well. In fact, if you look at Singapore or Finland and compare them against our top 20%, the United States is number one. We know how to educate. The question is, we haven't made a commitment to all our people. And so, yes, will that cost money? Absolutely. But this country has never, when it sets its mind on doing something like put a man on the moon, it sets its mind. Win a civil war against the enslavement, it sets its mind, it will do so. So I guess my thing is, first you have to introduce the idea. Most people don't even know there is something called an economic Bill of Rights. Why is that? Well, the tape so when Franklin Roosevelt gives that talk in 1944, he's sick the night he gives the talk. He doesn't go to the Capitol because he's too sick to go there, but he invites people in, the reporters, to hear him give his talk. And he says this, I'm going to say something really important that you need to record for posterity. Well, that tape, which we now have access to because Michael Moore found it, was lost for 70 years. So when I go into a classroom and say, hey, have you ever heard of the Economic Bill of Rights? Not one student. So first is just, we need to educate, I believe, what this idea of an economic Bill of Rights is. And then secondly, we've never as a country, when we've set our mind on doing something, we'll do it. And so I believe there will be, because I still believe we live in a democracy, and we spend money. The question is, who are we spending it on? And is it being spent on for for all our people or just for some? So I think once we change that, once we have the knowledge about an economic Bill of Rights, and two, that we make a commitment to it, we'll figure out where to get the money. That's my belief. So I'm kind of coming at it that way rather than going at the money. But of course, the money has to be addressed. But I also believe we'll have the reform of a tax system that doesn't give tax breaks to the 0.01%. And so that'll be a huge change when those changes happen, just as it was in these previous corrections in the United States, whether it was after with the New Deal or the progressive era that came out of the 1890s because of the incredible, outrageous inequality. This is not something new. We're just going around in a circle. We've come back full circle. But I think what's powerful about this economic Bill of Rights is an American idea. We don't like ideas from France or Germany, wherever. We like American ideas. And this is right at the heart of our Constitution and this understanding of a Bill of Rights. We all know what our political Bill of Rights, at least, we know what Amendment 1, or, the First Amendment, the right to free speech. We know that. Well, we need to have that same kind of knowledge around the right to a job, because there's not going to be, in the next 100 years, if we don't change this, there's still going to be this large amount of inequality and poverty in our country.
Right. Well, I'd like to sort of focus for just a second on
Yep.
one of the pieces that you just, one of the comments you just made, which was that we have the capacity. It's a question of are we serving everybody equally? And the
That's
obvious right. The obvious answer is no. One of the places that maybe it's as glaring as any is in the area of education. Now, we have a long history of free education in the United States.
Yep.
But being funded by local taxes, we essentially set up a system whereby there would be unequal
right.
opportunities and access
right.
for children living in different
That's
districts. Right. How did that
yeah.
come to be, and how is it, probably more importantly, that we continue to accept it?
Well, what's interesting about, and you saw in the book, is you look at public schools, if you look at them, they were always seen by the privileged as second class. The public schools were seen as, that's what, if you don't have enough money to go to a private school. And so that's the history of our public education. And we have to break that, I think, that idea, because still today that goes on in Silicon Valley with the educated, moneyed class going to private schools over the lack of funded schools that are in our community. So my hope is that as people see that history, they can then apply it to today. But as I do in the book, as I try to give 6 or 7 solutions to get us closer to these economic rights and the right to not just an education, but a good education. And that's the thing, is that, and we provide a great education to the top 20 and 30%. But what we don't do is provide a great education to the bottom 50. And all you got to do is when you look at the international scores and you compare us, we're kind of middle in the world when you look at industrialized nations, 30, 35. But if you look at the top 20 and 30, we're number 1. But we're in the middle because our bottom 30 and 40% are at the very bottom. We compare with the worst schools around the industrialized world. So that's what has to change. And so I just offer some, what I would say is common sense solutions. We have equal funding. every American, I would say, if you say, do you think it's equal to have equal opportunity in our country to give one kid 15 grand and one kid 5? Now, the Supreme Court did not rule on that in 1974. They chose 5-4 against it, but states have ruled in favor of the children and for an equality. And in our state, in California, we have a Governor Brown, who's put forward not just to equalize school funding, which we already have in this in state. It was Serrano versus Priest. It was a court case, but now has said, but for the poorest schools, they are actually in deficit, because they have, in the sense of the needs of the poorer students are greater than the upper class students, so they should actually get a bit more. And so he's put forward this formula of giving a bit more to the other. So I think that's one idea. There are many, but I think the other, if I would say, class size reduction. If you want to do anything besides get equal funding, is class size reduction. If you want to have better education, don't have 35, or like in Nevada, I talk in my book, 40 kindergartners in a class. If you want to have a crummy education system, do that. But if you want to have a great education system, as the president of our country knows, who puts Malia and Sasha in schools that have 16, that, we all know smaller class size counts. And there is great research from Tennessee and California that have done that and have seen increased test scores and just better education. So we know it can work, but it costs money, and there's got to be that commitment to have class size reduction. But those are some of the ideas, but I provide many more in the book.
Sure. Well, certainly it used to be that education through high school was relatively adequate, yes?
Yep.
There wasn't, relatively few were going on to college, to graduate school. Today, it's considerably much more the rule that it's the expectation even that children are going to go from high school to college. And certainly our kids are graduating with enormous debt.
That's right.
So I guess my question would be, do you see there being an extension, certainly more of a public subsidizing of colleges, so that our young people are graduating without incredibly burdensome debt?
Yeah.
Could that be a part to a good education?
As a person interested in social change, there's a movement, right? And it's been picked up by several candidates that we should either subsidize or even offer free public education. And I think what's interesting about that, when they say that, is that in the state of California, I teach at a California State University, but I graduated from a California State University, San Francisco State. I teach at San Jose State. When I graduated from SF State, my tuition, and they didn't even call it tuition because that was illegal. You paid a fee because they wanted to make it available for everybody. $250. That's what I paid a semester. And so for $500, and plus the fees that I paid to school was $550. My students are paying over $6,000 now. So this tenfold increase in their schooling is what's being expected of them, and they struggle to make that work. And so absolutely what you are calling for when it comes to education is, I think, part of the solution. But here's the thing, and I teach at the university. I believe in college education, but here's the reality. I just saw a study out of one of the universities back east that said this. It was at Georgetown. It said this: 97% of all quote unquote good jobs went to college educated people. 97% since the Great Recession. That means 3%, that's $40,000 or more. That's what they consider a good job. $43,000 or more. So 97% of those went to college educated people. 3% got the crummy jobs, or 3% got those good jobs. That means that the 97% got crummy jobs. And that group I'm particularly interested in. Why? Because 70% of all Americans don't have a college degree. So while I am all for getting more people into college, we're not going to solve this by getting more people into college. We're going to have to change the structure of such things as public works, living wage, right? Increase the minimum wage. We've got to figure out a way to protect our workers through, so unions aren't being bashed. And we've gone from 35% of the workforce down to 6.9% in the private sector. Part of that is we have a corporate mentality that crushes unions. That must be stopped.
Scott, is there anything else that we haven't discussed in our time together that you feel would be important for viewers to know?
Yeah, for me, I think Supreme Court Brandeis said it the best. He said we can either have the rule of the 1%, the elite of society, as we call it today, the plutocrats. We can have that, or we can have democracy. But we can't have both. And I think that, to me, sums up what my book, Ending Extreme Inequality, is addressing. Because here's the sad reality. 1% control 40% of all the wealth. That has gone up from 33% just 20 years ago. So this 1% continually rising, and the 0.01% even more so. So that group is doing great. But we've got to think about, we don't live in an aristocracy. We don't live with a king. We live in a democracy where all the people are supposed to have access to the wealth of society. But the very elite have been taking that. So I would say my hope is for the people listening, we need to assert our democracy and take our democracy back and have policies that would get us back to what I would say would get us to our economic rights.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
Our Constitution's framers were thoughtful, intelligent men with the forethought to protect us from all manner of abuse and incursion from our government. Yet perhaps because they were primarily men of property and wealth, they didn't think to secure our economic freedom as well. Thankfully, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, some 150 years later, thought to correct that oversight with a second Bill of Rights. He said, "We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence." May we now, some 70 years after his passing, complete his work. For Professor Scott Myers-Lipton, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.